Welcome back to another episode of Psychiatry Rewritten. My name is Lane. Today's episode is a conversation we really need to have. Because when it comes to mental health, few diagnoses carry more stigma than personality disorders. And if you've ever heard someone call someone else toxic, crazy, or manipulative, there's a good chance they were talking about a personality disorder, even if they didn't know it. So today, we're going to talk about what personality disorders really are, not what the internet says, and we'll walk through each cluster, explain the behaviors and the pain underneath, and most importantly, we're going to talk about treatment, because personality isn't permanent and neither is pain. So, what is a personality disorder really? Let's get clear from the start. A personality disorder isn't just a strong personality. It's not being intense or sensitive or particular. It's a deeply ingrained pattern of thinking, feeling, and behaving. So persistent that it affects someone's identity, relationships, and overall life. The key ingredients? The pattern is long-term. It causes significant distress or impairment. And here's the big one. It's often invisible to the person living it because it feels like just who they are. And the problem is, we treat it like a character flaw. Even the term personality disorder sounds judgmental. But these are patterns built from somewhere, usually early environments, trauma, emotional neglect, or inconsistent attachment. And when you zoom out, it's not bad behavior. It's a survival map. Let's get down to the clusters. Let's break down the clusters. Let's walk through the three main clusters of personality disorders, and we shall group them by shared characteristics. And I'll add a quick insight for each one, something humanizing that often gets missed about these disorders. So cluster A is considered the odd or eccentric personality disorders. The first one being paranoid personality disorder, which you have to think the distrust and suspicion, always on alert. It's often rooted in betrayal, trauma, or chronic invalidation. The second, schizoid personality disorder. Think about detached from relationships and emotions. They're not cold, but they're often overwhelmed by closeness or just never taught how to connect. The third is schizotypal personality disorder, and these individuals might have odd thoughts, magical beliefs, and a lot of social anxiety, and It's often seen in people who grew up in chaotic or isolating environments. And these individuals aren't weird. They've just learned not to trust the world. So, cluster B are considered the dramatic, emotional, or erratic personality disorders. So the first one is antisocial personality disorder, which is really a disregard for others and just a lack of remorse. This is common in those with childhood conduct disorder, abuse, neglect, or trauma. The second, one of the most well-known, I would say, and most stigmatized, borderline personality disorder. It's an intense fear of abandonment, unstable relationships, and emotional swings. This isn't manipulation. It's panic. It's pain turned all the way up. The third, histrionic personality disorder, which is excessive emotionality and attention seeking. Often, it's really a learned way of staying seen in emotionally starved environments. But it's seen as excessive emotionality and attention seeking, and it can be perceived that way. The fourth, narcissistic personality disorder. These individuals display grandiosity, whichever you prefer, need for admiration, and a very fragile ego. But underneath of all of that is deep shame, often masked with perfectionism or control. These people who are too much, they're people who weren't enough to someone for a long time. Cluster C. These are the anxious or fearful personality disorders. The first, avoidant personality disorder. Intense fear of rejection or extreme shyness. Think about, they often display social anxiety and shame and just this core belief of being not enough. The second is dependent personality disorder, and people often feel like they need to be taken care of, or they have a fear of being alone. And it usually stems from being punished or abandoned when they try to be independent. 3 is obsessive compulsive personality disorder, also OCPD, and this centers around perfectionism, rigidity, and control. It's not obsessive compulsive disorder. This is about identity. Control equals safety. So, like I said, cluster B is the most stigmatized. Borderline, narcissistic, antisocial, and histrionic. These are the personality disorders that people tend to fear, mislabel, or avoid altogether. But underneath the volatility or intensity, they're often built on pain, panic, shame, or loss of control. So, borderline personality disorder. Let's go inside the mind when triggered. They might think things like, they're pulling away. I can feel it. I must have said the wrong thing. I'm too much again. I have to fix it now before they leave. Where it comes from can often be linked to emotional neglect, childhood invalidation, abandonment, or trauma. Many individuals with BPD grew up in homes where emotions were punished, ignored, or wildly inconsistent. They learned love could vanish without warning. And BPD might show up as frantic fear of abandonment, frantic fear, unstable relationships, emotional outburst, identity confusion, impulsivity, self-harm, and black and white thinking. That is a big theme with BPD, which is they don't see a gray area. Everything is extreme. It's this way or it's this way. They feel like they love somebody or they absolutely hate them. There's no middle ground. Stigma and misunderstanding around BPD is often centered around the fact that they are mislabeled as manipulative, attention-seeking, or crazy. In truth, these are trauma responses, not power plays. Because the truth is, people with BPD don't want control. They want to not be left behind. So what healing can look like? Naming emotions before reacting to them. Building distress tolerance. Learning that conflict doesn't equal abandonment. Creating a stable sense of self over time. I feel rejected, but I'm not going to self-destruct. I'm going to ride this one out. I'm going to ride this out. Moving on to Narcissistic Personality Disorder, NPD. Inside the mind, when threatened, they think I'm a failure. I can't let them see me like this. I need to prove I'm the best. If I lose control, they'll never respect me again. It comes from often developing as a defense against deep shame or humiliation in childhood. Many individuals with NPD were either overpraised without emotional attunement or chronically criticized with love tied to achievement. And the result is a fragile sense of self-worth propped up by grandiosity. How it shows up might be as entitlement superiority, need for admiration, low empathy, reactivity to criticism, perfectionism, or control. A lot of the stigma and misunderstanding centers around them being seen as selfish, abusive, or arrogant. But NPD is often a shield, not an ego trip. Beneath the surface is usually a terrified child who learned vulnerability meant humiliation. They're not full of themselves. They're full of fear. They just hide it better. So, what healing can look like for somebody with NPD is learning to tolerate imperfection, building empathy through vulnerability, exploring shame without collapsing into it, and separating identity from performance. Even if I don't succeed, I still have worth. Moving right along to antisocial personality disorder. Inside the mind of somebody with ASPD who is in a crisis, they might think, people are weak. You can't trust anyone. If I don't protect myself first, I'll get used. Again. Rules are for people who believe in safety. I don't. So how does antisocial personality start to develop? Usually it comes from early conduct disorder, abuse, severe neglect, or environments with no stable caregiver or safety. Empathy may never have been modeled for them, and trust may never have existed. It might show up as disregard for others' rights, lying, impulsivity, deceitfulness, shallow affect, and repeated legal trouble. Much of the stigma and misunderstanding around antisocial personality disorder is them being labeled as monsters, psychopaths, or irredeemable. But antisocial personality is often an empathy breakdown rooted in survivalism, not sadism. If the world only ever showed you pain, would you expect kindness? What healing can look like? Structured, high accountability environments, long-term relational consistency, CBT and trauma-informed approaches, and rebuilding moral reasoning and empathy through modeled trust. I don't feel things like they do, but I can learn the impact of my actions. Moving on to histrionic personality disorder. So, inside the mind of somebody with histrionic personality disorder, when they feel unseen, could sound like, why isn't anyone noticing me? What did I do wrong? If I'm not interesting, I'm nothing. I need to turn it up, or I'll disappear. This comes from environments where emotions were rewarded for performance, not authenticity, or where affection was conditional. Individuals may have learned that being dramatic or entertaining was the only way to feel loved or acknowledged. It might show up as over-the-top emotionality, attention-seeking behavior, suggestibility, flirtation, shallow relationships, and rapid mood shifts. Stigma and misunderstanding is often centered around these individuals being dismissed as fake or over the top, over dramatic, or annoying. But the emotional intensity is usually a survival skill, not a personality flaw. They're not being extra. They're trying not to vanish. They want to make sure that they're seen. What healing can look like. Building self-worth beyond external validation. Learning emotional depth over performance. Developing secure reciprocal relationships. And becoming comfortable being quiet without feeling invisible. Even when I'm not performing, I still matter. So, some final reflections on cluster B. None of these patterns are random. They're adaptations. They're protection. They're old scripts that once kept someone alive, but now keep them alone, reactive, or misunderstood. And the truth is, these patterns can change, but only when we stop asking, what's wrong with you? And start asking, what happened to you? And how can we help you heal? So, cluster A is the misunderstood group. The paranoid, schizoid, and schizotypal. People in this cluster are often described as odd, withdrawn, or detached. But what looks like coldness or eccentricity is often a deep fear of harm or a long history of disconnection that taught them the world is unsafe, unpredictable, or unworthy of trust. So, starting with paranoid personality disorder and diving inside the mind of someone with paranoid personality when they feel threatened, it could sound like, why did they say it like that? Are they trying to embarrass me? I know they're planning something. I have to protect myself. No one else will. This comes from roots of betrayal, trauma, or environments where trust was repeatedly broken, including growing up with manipulative, abusive, or emotionally unpredictable caregivers. Some may have been gaslit or scapegoated, leading to chronic hypervigilance. It could show up as persistent distrust, reading hidden motives into neutral events, holding grudges, difficulty with forgiveness, guardedness, anger, or coldness in relationships. A lot of the stigma and misunderstanding center around being labeled as paranoid, rigid, or hostile. But this isn't about irrationality. It's about someone who learned long ago that trust is dangerous. They're not suspicious for no reason. They're living in a world that's never felt safe. What healing can look like? Slowly building safe, therapeutic relationships. Learning to tolerate ambiguity without assuming harm. So some things just aren't meant for you to know. Challenging rigid thought patterns around betrayal. Maybe I don't know their intention, but that doesn't mean they're out to get me. Another from this group is schizoid personality disorder. So to go inside the mind of somebody with schizoid personality disorder when they feel overwhelmed might sound like, it's too much. I just want to be alone. I don't feel anything around people. I'm not meant for connection. And this comes from often developing in early childhood where emotional needs were ignored, punished, or met with overwhelming demands. Some individuals learned that detaching completely was the only safe option, retreating inward to preserve a sense of control. It could show up as a lack of desire for close relationships, emotional detachment, preference for solitary activities, flat affect, limited interest in sexual or social connection. The stigma and misunderstanding surrounding schizoid personality disorder has to do with them being seen as cold, robotic, or antisocial. But this detachment is often a trauma response, a form of emotional shutdown used to survive overstimulation or relational chaos. they're not emotionless. They've just spent years hiding their feelings, even from themselves. What healing can look like for schizoid personality disorder is gently exploring safe emotional experiences, supporting autonomy while inviting connection, and naming and tolerating emotional states without panic. I don't have to be alone forever. I can connect, even if it feels unfamiliar. The last disorder for cluster A that we're going to talk about is schizotypal personality disorder. This is one of the reasons that I wanted to do this episode, because I don't know that schizotypal personality disorder is something that people discuss very frequently. I don't hear it mentioned or discussed very much. And I think that people are quick to jump to diagnoses of schizophrenia. And that is something very important that I want to touch on as well in another episode. So, schizotypal personality disorder. And inside the mind of somebody with this disorder, when they are stimulated or overwhelmed, might sound like, I felt something strange in that room. Something shifted. I know it sounds weird, but I can't explain it. People don't get me, but I don't get them either. This disorder comes from often to early isolation. It's often tied to early isolation, neglect, or environments where magical thinking was normalized, or where no one helped make sense of reality. Many report feeling different from a very young age, as if they were outsiders in their own homes. Sometimes it might show up as odd beliefs or magical thinking, unusual perceptual experiences, paranoia, social anxiety, eccentric appearance or behavior, and vague or tangential speech. A lot of the stigma surrounding schizotypal is them being frequently mislabeled as crazy, delusional, or unreachable. In truth, schizotypal individuals often have rich inner lives and intense longing for connection. They just struggle to relate in expected ways. They're not broken. They just speak a language no one ever tried to learn. And what healing can look like is normalizing atypical perceptions while grounding in shared reality. Building connection without forcing conformity. And clarifying thinking patterns without shame. I can have unusual thoughts and still be part of the world. And some people may not know what magical thinking really is. So let's talk about magical thinking a little bit. It sounds kind of whimsical, like something out of a fairy tale. But in psychiatry, magical thinking has a specific meaning. It's when someone believes their thoughts, actions, or words can directly influence the world in a way that defies logic or physical laws. For example, a child might believe that stepping on a crack really will break their mother's back. That's developmentally normal. But when this kind of belief continues into adulthood or shows up in ways that cause distress or impairment, it can signal something deeper. Here's a real-world example. Someone avoids thinking about their friend getting in a car accident because they're convinced that thinking it will make it happen. Or they perform a specific ritual, like tapping a door frame 3 times, because they believe it will protect their family from harm. It's not delusional. They might even know it isn't rational. A lot of the time they know that. But the urge to do it, or the fear that something bad might happen if they don't, feels way too strong to ignore. Magical thinking can show up in several places. And you may be thinking, in OCD, as part of obsessive fears and compulsive behaviors, in schizotypal personality disorder, where it's more tied to unusual beliefs or ideas of reference, and sometimes in grief or trauma, like believing a loved one's death was punishment for something you thought or did. The key is this: magical thinking is emotionally real, even if it's not logically true. And it often comes from a deep desire to feel control in a world that feels unsafe or unpredictable. So no, it's not just weird thoughts. It's the mind doing its best to make sense of fear, loss, or chaos. And that's worth understanding. Final reflections on Cluster A. These aren't people who don't want connection. They're people who learned it wasn't safe, or that their way of being didn't fit into the world around them. They may be private, odd, withdrawn, or skeptical, but behind those defenses are real humans who've adapted to survive disconnection. And with the right support, they don't have to stay hidden. And from a clinical point of view, not all pain looks sympathetic. Not all trauma looks like withdrawal or tears. Some trauma rages. Some trauma clings. Some trauma criticizes, flatlines, or pushes you away the moment you get close. But it's all still trauma. If you find yourself avoiding patients with personality disorders, ask yourself why. If you are using words like manipulative, difficult, or non-compliant, ask where those reactions are coming from. And if you're tempted to write someone off before the second session, remember this. What looks like dysfunction may be someone's best attempt to survive a world that didn't meet them with safety. Your job isn't to diagnose and distance. It's to stay curious, stay regulated, and stay. Because that's what they've never had. These aren't needy or rigid people. They're people whose anxiety became their blueprint. Okay, let's move on to a Mythbusters Personality Disorder edition. Let's bust some of the biggest, most harmful myths I hear all the time. Myth number 1. People with borderline personality disorder are manipulative. The truth is, most of the time, what's called manipulation is actually a dysregulated survival strategy. When someone fears abandonment so deeply that they panic, they might beg, threaten, or lash out. It's not because they want control. It's because they're feeling desperate. It's because they're terrified of losing safety. If the only way you ever got attention was by breaking down, you'd break down too. Myth number 2. Narcissists are just selfish. The truth is, narcissistic traits often form in response to deep shame. Perfectionism, grandiosity, and entitlement are defenses, not identities. People with NPD can struggle with self-worth so severely that they create an identity they think will finally earn love or respect. Myth number 3. You can't treat a personality disorder. The truth. DBT, schema therapy, MBT, long-term psychodynamic therapy. There are evidence-based treatments, but they take time, safety, and trust. It is challenging, and it's not fast, but it's possible. And the sooner you do the work, the sooner you can live a more fulfilling life. Myth number 4. People with personality disorders hurt others on purpose. But the truth is that people with personality disorders often hurt themselves emotionally far more than anyone else ever sees. Self-harm, rage, dissociation, panic, shame spirals. It's not about causing harm. It's about trying to survive something invisible. So what actually helps? Here's the good news, everyone. Treatment exists and it works. DBT, dialectical behavior therapy, teaches emotional regulation, distress tolerance, mindfulness, and interpersonal skills. So back to the relationships and having fulfilling relationships. Gold standard. DBT is the gold standard for borderline personality disorder. Schema therapy focuses on changing deep-rooted beliefs formed in childhood. MBT, mentalization-based therapy, which builds insight into thoughts, feelings, and relational patterns. Psychodynamic therapy explores core wounds, defenses, and early attachment issues. Group therapy, which helps normalize, challenge, and repair relational patterns. And medication, not for the personality disorder itself, but medication can help with mood, anxiety, or impulsivity, which makes the healing process easier for some people. And here's what else helps. A consistent, non-judgmental, trauma-informed relationship. Clinicians who stay. Clinicians who listen. Clinicians who don't give up when the behavior gets big. So let's break down the stigma a little more. Why the stigma is so strong and so wrong. Let's be honest. These diagnoses scare people, including clinicians. Why? Because personality disorders show up in the relationship, even the clinical one. They bring intensity, boundary testing, rupture and repair cycles. They evoke feelings in the provider, and not all of them are comfortable. But if we label people as difficult, untreatable, or manipulative, we stop being clinicians. We become judges. And that's not what healing is about. Here's the truth. Most people with personality disorders have lived through trauma, invalidation, or chaos. Many have never felt emotionally safe, ever. And most of them don't want to be this way. I hear it every day. People seek treatment every day for these type of symptoms because they don't want to feel how they feel. They just haven't been given the tools, the space, or the time to heal yet. Personality disorders, they get thrown around like insults. Crazy, manipulative. But here's what most people don't know. Roughly 1 in 11 adults in the US meets criteria for a personality disorder. That's over 30 million people just in this country. and yet we rarely talk about them in a way that's human or accurate. Some people get misdiagnosed for years, bouncing between labels like bipolar, ADHD, or depression, because no one ever stopped to ask why their patterns made sense in the first place. In fact, research shows it takes an average of 6 to 10 years to receive an accurate diagnosis for borderline personality disorder, if you ever get one at all. Another study shows that over 40% of people diagnosed with borderline personality disorder were previously misdiagnosed with bipolar disorder, major depression, or ADHD. Why is this? Because when someone swings emotionally, lashes out, or clings too tightly, we assume drama. But what we're often looking at is panic, pain, and a brain wired for abandonment. And the myth you can't treat a personality disorder, actually you can. And the research is crystal clear. Dialectical behavior therapy, one of the gold standard treatments for BPD, has been shown to reduce self-harm and hospitalization rates by over 50%. And in long-term studies, up to 85% of people with BPD go into full remission over time with the right support. These disorders aren't life sentences. They're survival patterns, and they can absolutely change. And I'm sorry if people have made you believe that they can't. But they can absolutely change, especially when someone finally feels safe enough to stop fighting. So, if you take one thing from this episode, let it be this: you are not broken beyond repair. And if you're a clinician, remember, they don't need you to fix them. They need you to stay long enough to show them they're worth fixing themselves. Let's stop calling people manipulative when they're dysregulated. Let's stop writing off disorders we don't understand. And let's start remembering that even the most painful personality traits were once someone's best chance at survival. The traits that hurt them are the same ones that once protected them. I'm glad you're here, and I'll see you next time.